China stands firm on its status as a developing nation at the World Trade Organization, despite criticism from the United States. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States has long complained that too many members of the World Trade Organization define themselves as developing countries and is seeking a review. Currently, two-thirds of the 164 members, including China, enjoy preferential trade treatment by designating themselves a developing country at the WTO. The status allows China to provide subsidies in agriculture and set higher barriers to market entry for more developed countries, and it gives Beijing more time to implement any agreement. Gao Feng, a spokesman for the Ministry of Commerce, said China's position is clear. Quote, China is the largest developing country in the world. We do not shy away from our international responsibilities and are willing to assume obligations in the WTO that are compatible with our own economic development level and capabilities, end quote. Well, there is lots to discuss. For more on China's developing country status at the World Trade Organization, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Beijing is John Gong. He's a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. From Portland, Oregon, Liang is an associate professor of economics at Willamette University. Shada Islam is the director for Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe, an independent think tank in Brussels. And Trachtman is a professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. Welcome to all of you to the show. Joel, let's start off in Massachusetts. Does the United States have a point in calling for this review at the WTO?
Oh, I think that the United States does. The WTO is a system of reciprocal arrangements between states, and I think the United States' concern is that other states are not reciprocating sufficiently. And over the years, there's been much more variation in developing countries. And China, of course, is a large trader with great technological capacities, not like Ghana or Rwanda or some other developing countries. And so I think that the solution has to be not what the United States is proposing, to have China be treated as a developed country, but to look more precisely at the types of issues that merit China being treated differently and treat China that way. So this has to be negotiated more precisely.
John Gong, what is your view? China is the world's second largest economy. It's a leader in many technologies, and in some sectors like transport, it is the world leader. What is the Chinese argument for retaining development nation status?
Well, China's official argument is based on the fact that China's GDP per capita is still very much in line with the category of in developing countries. You know, China's GDP per capita is around about $10,000, which is not that much actually. I think the pictures most foreigners see is a little bit misleading. You know, people seeing things in city of Beijing, Shanghai. I mean, that's more of an exception than a rule. There's still vast amount of areas in China that are not so much developed. $10,000 per capita GDP is actually pretty low. And even if take into account, say, purchasing power parity calculation, it's around $16,000, which is only way less than a third of U.S. GDP per capita figure. So, so I think the argument is based on facts. China is very much a unbalanced developing country where there's, as I said, vast amounts of areas that are very low living standard, I think, especially in the rural areas, in the southwest area and the northwest areas that are still not very developed. Okay. So it's based on fact like this.
Joel, is that a fair point that John Gong makes, that if you look at the criteria of GDP per capita, then China is very much a developing country?
It's perfectly accurate. The United States is arguing for looking at other things like membership in the OECD or membership in the G20. So it's identifying other factors. Here's the thing, two questions. One is, does the special and differential treatment that comes along with being a developing country actually benefit the poor people in China? And there, I think the economic evidence is quite limited. Although, as I said before, you have to look at specific functional areas to see where it's important to provide this kind of special and differential treatment. I think the other thing that is really important is this idea of reciprocity. And to have reciprocity, you need to have reliable commitments from your counterparty. And the United States is negotiating with China and is saying, we are concerned that this developing country status that you're claiming is going to make your commitments less reliable and also result in you claiming lower commitments than what would really be required for true reciprocity.
All right, let's go to Brussels and bring in Shada Islam. Shada, the European Union Commissioner, I want to look at the bigger picture here. The Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, she described the task of reforming the WTO as urgent, and she said that it's an organization that's needed. International trade without the WTO would be, in her words, anarchic. From Europe's point of view, what are the reforms that are needed at the WTO?
Yes, you're right, Nanan, to put it in the wider context of the WTO reform more generally, and that's top of the agenda for the European Union. It has, in fact, set up working groups on reforming the WTO with the Chinese, with the Americans and the Japanese. And top of the agenda at the moment is to get this appellate body, this dispute settlement system working again. The Americans are blocking the appointment of a judge, and if they don't, change that, this system gets broken. And dispute settlement in the WTO is a cornerstone of making sure that, the trade is not law of the jungle. So that's very important. Second point, China is not alone in saying that it is still a developing country. As you know, it's been joined by India, it's been joined by South Africa, it's been joined by Venezuela. The difference now is that Brazil has decided that, yes, it can be graduated out of this, and it's agreed that if it does so, it joins the OECD or starts the process anyway. So that's important as well. For the European Union, WTO, multilateral rules-based trading order, is crucial for the future of the world economy and world prosperity.
Liang, China wants to keep its status as a developing country, but Beijing has also recognized that the WTO is in need of reform. What kind of reforms would Beijing like to see?
I think if any reform is needed, we need to have a stronger voice from the developing nations. I wanted to go back to Joe's point that first, whether or not these special and differential treatments should be determined on the case-by-case basis. I would say that, it should be, in the hand of the developing nations to determine, in what areas they need these kind of treatments and in what areas they have the capacity to liberalize or to commit themselves to the more free and open trade agreements. And for his first point, I think, when it comes to agriculture protection and also, in market access in, for example, the service industry, it does benefit the really poor people in China, immigrant workers from the rural areas or farmers for that matter. And I think that, I agree that WTO needs to be reformed, but I think what the U.S. has proposed right now at the table, for example, to really narrow the list of developing nations, exclude countries that are from the G20, from OECD, from countries that have more than 0.5% of the global trade. I think this will significantly narrow the eligibility and therefore make these special and differential treatments meaningless.
Joel, you want to respond to that?
Oh, yes. The way that negotiations occur at the WTO is reciprocal. You don't get liberalization in other states unless you grant liberalization in your own state. And so the problem that developing countries have had throughout history at the GATT and at its successor, the WTO, is that this special and differential treatment caused them to decline to make concessions. And so concessions were not made for the products in which they were interested. And I understand Professor Liang's point that it's for developing countries themselves to determine what's important to them, but then they have to negotiate that with other states to create this reciprocity so that they can get the kinds of market opportunities that they're looking for.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to address two issues. One is whether the history of China stealing at WTO has benefited the poor. I think there's no doubt about the fact that we have lifted, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. A lot of people here in China benefit immensely from China's economy, integrated into the world economy, benefited from China's accession to the WTO. So I think there's no doubt about it. The second issue about reciprocity, I think we have a negotiation right now with the United States, and I think there were indicators saying that all indications are saying that we are very close to concluding a trade agreement here. So, so I think the concerns the United States has with respect to China's trading relationship can be addressed based on a bilateral basis. And I think it doesn't have to go through this very complicated process at WTO, trying to challenge China's developing country status. Now, I have to also admit that this process of declaring yourself as a developing country needs to have a graduation process. I think there's no graduation process right now, and I certainly agree that there got to be a process there to end that you're entitled to this status forever. I think there should be a process to change that, and China is willing to, I think, is willing to negotiate for a process to graduating from a developing country status. So I think all these issues can be negotiated. It doesn't have to be sort of convoluted together with the WTO reform.
Shada Islam, I want to get back to a point you brought up earlier, and that was the work of the appellate division at the WTO and the fact that it is short of judges right now. The United States has blocked the appointment of new judges. It's led to some paralysis on the part of the WTO doing its work. What is Europe's proposals to fix that?
Well, I'll give you a minute, that in a minute, but I want to say about, this is, when I hear about another sort of U.S. demand from China and then China pushing back, this is just part of this epic strategic competition that's going on at the moment between America and China, whether it's in trade, whether it's tech, whether it's on, strategic issues. It seems to me that these two economic giants are just finding more and more ways of confrontationally engaging with each other. And we as Europeans, I think we find that rather disheartening and not very reassuring for the future of world trade. I mean, countries have to, and we believe a lot here on multilateral rules, on cooperative leadership, and America at the moment and China are not really showing that. They're all in it for their national interest. And, when we talk about the WTO, Anand, we're talking about 164 countries. World trade at the moment, as the Director General has said, is going down, and most of it is because of the uncertainty at the moment, because, we're talking trade wars, trade confrontation, we're talking about, punishing each other. This is very, very bad for world trade and bad for poor countries and very bad for developed countries as well. So these two giants have to come to some kind of a conclusion and sort of end this confrontation. From the European point of view, I think the main thing is that countries have to come together and try and work out a new system, a dispute settlement system, which is fairer. Now, I don't want to go into the details now, but it's part of an overhaul, which will include also talking about subsidies, industrial subsidies. That's something that China's interested in. It's about talking about technology transfer, intellectual property protection, and more and more and more. So, we have to get countries working on the first bit, what's broken now, fix it, and then start talking about overall reform and revamping the WTO. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process. And the current ambiance, the current sort of negotiations going on between the U.S. and China aren't very helpful.
Okay. Joel Trachtman, I'd like to get your view on this. Is what we're seeing now essentially a battle between the United States and China for strategic and geopolitical dominance?
I think that is a large part of the motivation. It's not the only thing. There are economic issues, normal kinds of economic issues between the United States and China in this area, but that is part of the motivation when we look at technology transfer and intellectual property issues like that. There's definitely a geostrategic aspect. Now, it's true that the appellate body is under siege by the United States because the United States has declined to come to a consensus, which is required in order to appoint new judges. And the United States has some technical concerns, but its most basic concern is that there have been some interpretations of WTO law, ones that I think are correct, that have curtailed the United States' ability to apply anti-dumping duties in a technical area we call zeroing. And that's been a big issue, and it may be one that can be negotiated. So I think that the WTO has to be renegotiated. Some of the expectations that we had in the United States, and I think in Europe as well, about how China would develop, how it would become more of a market economy from 2001 when it joined the WTO until today, we're frustrated, and now it's time to renegotiate. And I think that's the way to understand the Trump administration. Partly, it's time to renegotiate the deal, and also we're worried about geostrategic competition with China.
Liang, talking about reform of the WTO, the Director General of the organization, Roberto Azevedo, is defending it. He's defending the organization while at the same time acknowledging that there needs to be changes. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
The word reform means what it means. It means changing things. It doesn't mean destroying or throwing away what we have. What it means is let's improve what we have. Let's build on what we have to make it stronger, to make it more responsive, to make it a positive actor in the global economic and trade relations. I think we don't need to rethink the whole system.
So Liang, is China on board with those sentiments that the WTO is in need of some changes, but it doesn't have to be dismantled completely and sort of be rebuilt from the ground upwards?
I think so. I think as China stated very clearly that it will assume the responsibility as the largest developing nation at the WTO. So I think ironically, one of the things that, what China needs to do is actually, stand on its ground and defend the interests of the developing nations. I want to go back to Joe's point about reciprocity, which I think, yes, it is the, pillar of the WTO's objective. But I think we should not just talking about reciprocal treatments without considering countries' developmental status and their market economic structure. So I think for China, as the speakers have talked about before, it has still very low per capita GDP, far from that high-income country $12,000 threshold as defined by the WTO. It does have a large share of trade, but a lot of times 40% of the Chinese exports are actually produced by the foreign invested companies. So I think we need to take into account different countries' developmental status. As WTO includes development as one of its agendas since 2001 Doha round negotiations. The second point that I want to make also is when we think about reciprocal treatments, we need to look at overall the WTO agenda is largely shaped by developed nations and meets their interest. If we look at the agreements on trade-related investment measures, as we all know, the U.S. Accounts for more than a quarter of the global 500. So these investment measures give really advantages for these multinational companies. And also the agreements on trade-related intellectual property rights. The U.S.'s gain on the IP trade is 27 times that of China, 180 times that of India, and 200 times that of Brazil. So I think, again, we need to consider the big picture where we're just trying to carve, a smart room to make trade more developmental friendly for developing nations.
Joel, so looking at this calls for major reforms, doesn't it? Giving a voice to smaller nations, developing nations at the WTO.
Well, I actually wonder whether that's true. China is a big player, the European Union, the United States, Brazil. We have a number of India, we have a number of big countries. And some of the smallest countries under the principle of sovereign equality have an equal voice, but very small population. So I think we need to be careful about that. I also think that it's just impractical to think of the WTO as a redistributive organization. I understand that claim, and I'm personally sympathetic to it, but I think as a practical matter, demands for simple redistribution are not being heard at the WTO. So I think the question is still one of how can developing countries get more market access, more opportunities to compete through reciprocation. And I want to really emphasize this point. Much of what we call special and differential treatment, permission to protect your markets in a way that other countries are not permitted, extra market access in other countries, like the generalized system of preferences that we have here in the United States that India and Turkey are about to be kicked out of. Those things have not been shown to benefit developing countries. What has been shown to benefit developing countries is market access in export markets.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that in the case of the generalized system of preferences run by the European Union, several countries, including India and Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, which get everything but arms concessions, they have worked and they have helped these countries to capture more market share than they would have without the GSP. And China and India are now graduated out of the GSP as well. So that's something that the European Union has done on a bilateral level. But also, Anand, many of these countries that are in the WTO are also doing their bilateral and regional free trade deals with each other, with regions. And that's where the action, that's where the focus has moved now. And that, I think, is not that good, because you need a multilateral system as well. So I think I can understand that Azevedo, the Director General, is concerned, because these FTAs, these regional deals, are outside the WTO.
Okay, I want to look at the relationship, Shada, between Europe and the United States. President Trump put out this tweet not so long ago. He said the World Trade Organization finds that the European Union subsidies to Airbus has adversely impacted the United States, which will now put tariffs on $11 billion worth of EU products. The EU has taken advantage of the United States on trade for many years. It will soon stop, exclamation mark. The EU says that it will soon slap tariffs on about $20 billion worth of US imports into Europe. Are we seeing the beginnings of another trade war here?
Exclamation mark. I think that is important to stress. Look, relations between the European Union and the United States when it comes to trade are not in a very good shape at the moment, and we see that. You know, Donald Trump doesn't like the European Union. It's a multilateral trading system. You know, it's cooperative and all the things that he doesn't really like. So he doesn't really want the European Union to be back into the sort of top ally status that it had before. So yes, we are in a very, very peculiar trade situation where there's skirmishes all the time. This Airbus, Boeing subsidy quarrel has been there for decades. I mean, it's been there for many, many years. It keeps cropping up when, you know, tensions arise in other areas as well. And now, as you know, Cecilia Malmström, the European Trade Commissioner, is trying very hard to negotiate. She says she wants a deal by very, very quickly, a trade deal which excludes agriculture, but a US-EU trade deal which we are hoping here in Europe means that the Americans will not then impose tariffs on German cars. So it's a very complicated situation at the moment. And it's, you know, the EU and US may be allies, but this is not a very good situation at the moment. You know, with friends like these, we say here, who needs enemies?
Right.
I saw that tweet by President Trump as a positive sign. Because the Boeing-Airbus US-EU dispute, as Shada has said, has been going on for many years, but it's been managed through WTO dispute settlement, in which the WTO panels and appellate body have found that both have illegally subsidized their airline industries, and both are entitled under this multilateral system, which we want the United States to comply with, to impose these retaliations. So that's an example of the system working to manage a very difficult trade dispute.
Yeah, I want to add a note about this Airbus issue. I mean, the Section 301 investigation initiated by Mr. Lighthizer office against the European Union, in my opinion, is totally uncalled for. There have been 2 rulings from WTO regarding the subsidies for the Airbus airplanes. One being Airbus 380, which is actually discontinued right now. The other one is Airbus 325, which I don't think is a very significant competitor to the Boeing 787. And these 2 rulings have been in favor of the United States in the past. And they've been waiting for an arbitration. What's at issue here is that the United States claims that the EU's remedy hasn't been to the fullest extent, hasn't been up to the requirements specified in that ruling. So that's why they're going to this arbitration. And the United States government could have waited for a few more months for this arbitration to come out. But instead, it's starting another Section 301 investigation. And also, it's stuffing other stuff into this new trade tariffs, including agricultural products targeting France. I mean, I think this is totally uncalled for.
Okay, Liang, one final point, and that is President Trump has threatened to walk away from the WTO if he doesn't get his way on reforms. What impact could that have on world trade if he carries out that threat?
Well, I think it would be, destructive. I think, again, that would be a total abandonment of the whole multilateral system of trade, and it would be unfair for many of the countries who, joined WTO with the faith to commit themselves to free trade. And I think in that case, it would be a totally, power play. And from a historical point of view, the United States climbed up the economic ladder, through, other countries, opening up for markets and through its own protectionist and industrial policies. After all, between 1830s to all the way post-Second World War, the U.S. has the highest tariff rate on manufacturing products around the world. So I think the U.S. has enjoyed the system as it grew, as it developed. And now, I think it makes no sense and unfair to simply kick away the ladder.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.